So you've been asked to put together a public-facing report for your startup, or a set of procedures that all employees in the company are expected to follow, or an important instruction manual for a new hire. You're expected to make this document visually or aesthetically pleasing, in addition to user-friendly, usable, and technically correct. Today, I'll give you a quick and dirty primer on some design principles that can take your documents from drab to fab. So when I say document design, what do you think of? Lots of people think about like magazine layout or using Publisher to put together a newsletter. But there are lots of different small and finite elements that add together to create a design. It can be anything from fonts, typeface, typography, to color, to our use of symbols or images or pictures, to something as seemingly small as the headings on the page or the page numbers on a document that spans multiple or hundreds of pages. Document design includes how we use alignment and tabs, how our text falls on the page, the justification of the text, different features, sizes, or weights of type, even things like letter case. Do we present titles in all caps? Are the first letter of every word capitalized, or just the first letter of the sentence? This is also document design. Things that contribute to make a document look professional or sloppy. All of these need to be guided by a certain type of understanding. Rhetorical principles are how we persuade, guide how we use document design principles. Accessibility and usability. Can people with disabilities access the information? And does the document design help the user in completing their task? Arrangement and emphasis. And then finally, the bedrock of what we're learning today, the principles of contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity, which should undergird all of the design work that you do. There are a few different mnemonics that folks use to remember design principles. Visual hierarchy or reading patterns are the technical study of how your eye moves through the page. There are certain ways that we, at least in Western societies that read from left to right, expect to read documents. And there are also two mnemonics that are really helpful: hats and crap. We'll start with hats. Hats is a user-centered design mnemonic. It helps us to foreground the needs of the people who are using our information when we're designing it. So HAT stands for headings, access, typography, and space. Again, it's a user-centered approach. Headings, access, typography, and space help us to highlight important information for our user, guide their eyes through the document in a logical way, and point to the things that they need to find. Headings help us to signpost. They basically say in bold or colorful or different typographic fonts, this is what you should pay attention to. They highlight important information and they help to give a sense at a glance of what's contained in the document. Here's an example of headings from a report put out by an academic research team. You can see here that the headings establish a sense of hierarchy. The orange, larger text says, this is the big question we're answering. The slightly smaller teal text gives a sense of the divisions of the answer to the question. So here font color and size are being used to differentiate between sections of the paper. You can also tell that a heading's a heading because it's left aligned in this document. And it's consistent throughout. Access. Things that help us with accessing content are indentations, lines, columns, and bullet points. Numbered and ordered lists are a big signal to us saying, here are some key points and here are how they're divided. Indents, lines, and columns also help to set off important information, signaling to our brain to pay attention. Typography also assists with this. Some things with typography: when you're putting together professional documents, you generally want to choose a formal font, not anything too scripty, not anything too elaborate or bookish. Left justify your text unless you have a reason not to that's really good. And when I say left justify, generally I mean left aligned, but not justified text. Leave a ragged edge because that helps aid the reader in understanding where a line ends and a new line begins. Try to keep your fonts to no more than 3 in a document. More than 3, it can seem cluttered, confusing, or disorganized. And use your font formatting strategically and sparingly. If everything is bolded or underlined, then nothing is important. Finally, space. 1-inch margins are the standard for a reason. It gives some padding to the document, but not so much space that the document seems empty. You can use more in some printed forms to give a little bit more room to breathe, but you've got to be able to explain and justify your decision to do this. Balance the page, but don't overcrowd it. So CRAP, or contrast, repetition, alignment, proximity, is another way to think about design. It's less user-centered and more aesthetically centered. These are centered in principles of art and visual rhetoric or communication that have been honed through the ages. Contrast helps to identify important information as well. By having a contrasting color or size or font, it points it out and says, look at me. But contrast isn't just about colors, right? The difference between black and white, but it can also be contrast between shapes, styles, emotions. Here's an example of a contrasting font, but also contrasting color. We have light accents on this event poster on a dark background, and we have really bold, slabby fonts paired with skinny script fonts. So kind of a mix between feminine and masculine, bold and subtle here. All these images, by the way, come from a folder that I keep of designs. When I see a design out in the wild in my everyday life that I like, I save it so I can use it as inspiration or as an example for a designer if I'm contracting out work later. Here's another example of contrast. We have some very clear lines throughout this document with the orange rule line on the side, the square photo, and the justified text, which makes the sizzling and the headline of sizzling summer burgers stand out even more. The movement of this header contrasts with the lines throughout. Your eye immediately goes to that, or maybe it goes to it after the image of the delicious hamburger. I'm very hungry right now. Here's another example of contrast. This is a somewhat misleading poster from when I was in college from the Society of News Design Club. You can see free pizza is a huge font, something like 150 points, while the others are like 20 points. It's a slabby, bold font, and it contrasts with the rest of the image on the page just by virtue of its size. Repetition. Repetition helps create patterns and unity in the document. Repeated elements give something for our eye to return to. It creates a sense of visual interest, and it helps you to understand a logical reading pattern in the document. Here's an example of repetition from a resume from someone who lived down the hall from me in the dorms in college. You can see this repeated element of circles and numbers throughout the document that help us to get a sense of the major divisions in its content, as well as to show the progression of information down the left-hand side of this large column on the right. Here's another example of repetition from an advertisement for a church event. I love the use of these boxes throughout. The pattern, as well as the cutouts at the top and at the bottom that point to where the important information is. The tagline for the event following the call, as well as the event information, where it's happening and when it's taking place. Breaking repetition in this way is just as valuable as repeating elements. Alignment. Alignment can make or break a document. Sloppy alignment things like inconsistent spacing between lines or paragraphs of text can really make a document seem unprofessional. In another sense, very consistent alignment helps a document to seem orderly, organized, clean. Here's an example of a slight break in alignment that makes a document seem interesting. The G in agenda here is tilted to the side, which makes us think, because this is an ad for an LGBTQ radio show or podcast, thinks about the queering of things, or how the gay agenda might be different from the straight agenda. It creates some visual interest. Finally, proximity. If you group like items together and separate different items apart from each other, it helps to create that logical reading pattern and contributes as well to that sense of alignment and repetition. Putting items that are related together and separating them from different items gives room to breathe on the page and helps us to use blank space or white space to our advantage. Don't be afraid of blank space in a document. Do not be afraid to have open corners or margins. White space is actually your friend. A common beginner's mistake for designers is trying to put too many things on the page and in turn sacrificing reading order and just a sense of logical balance to the document. Here's an example of proximity from a McDonald's annual report. You can see that chunks of related information are put together, but there's some border or margin at the bottom of this lower left yellow section as well as in the blue sections. The text isn't filling up all the boxes, and that gives a sense of balance to the page and helps the reader not to feel too overwhelmed by these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different chunks of information on a single page. Here are a few more examples from infographics. Infographics are really hot right now as a method of visual communication and as a way to provide information in a way that's a little more interesting than blocks of text or even simple tables. How is contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity used throughout these infographics? The contrast of colors or sizes, repetition of boxes, visual elements or types of statistics, proximal information put together or separated. Also the use of different fonts to provide a sense of visual interest. I hope that this crash course in visual design gives you some things to think about as you're creating your first designed documents. As always, I'm available if you have any questions or any design needs. Happy designing!